Many people, including myself, like to argue that marketing is, of course, the most important function of the business. The reason for that is that marketing is responsible for generating the revenues and profits for the organization. Without revenues and profits, there is no business. So, marketing activities of the organization often result in direct impacts on the income statements for the organization. So, let's take a little look at how marketing impacts the financial statements, but also how marketing impacts the financial activities associated with an organization. For many marketing decisions, you need to consider the profits, the revenues, and the costs that will result. Profit, of course, is generated by revenues minus costs. So let's take a real quick look at revenues again. Revenues are the total amount of money brought in by a firm measured over a set amount of time. A business's revenue is its gross income before subtracting out any expenses. So it is all of the money that the company brings in. Profits and total earnings define revenue. It is the financial gain through which sales and services are rendered. So, if we're going to talk about marketing, finance, and profits, we need to consider profits, revenue, and costs. Let's start with costs. Well, costs are an important aspect of a company because it is all of the money that is an outlay. But all costs are not the same. There are variable and fixed costs, relevant versus sunk costs, and avoidable versus unavoidable costs. Let's spend a little time talking about variable and fixed costs. Variable costs are any costs that a company incurs that are associated with the number of goods or services it produces. A company's variable costs increase and decrease with the production volumes. That is, the more goods I produce or sell, the more my variable costs increase or decrease. Variable costs are things that are directly tied to producing a product and selling it, typically things like labor and raw materials. But it could also be things like commissions, delivery expenses, and shipping. Fixed costs, on the other hand, are normally independent of the firm's specific business activities. Variable costs increase as production rises and decreases, but fixed costs remain the same regardless of production output. So fixed costs are things that don't change no matter how much you sell. Fixed costs typically include things like mortgage payments, lease payments, rental payments, insurance, interest payments on outstanding loans. These are costs that are incurred every time period, no matter how much you produce. So, how do these costs affect marketing strategies? Well, firms with high fixed costs versus and firms with low fixed costs compared to variable costs tend to focus on different things. So, companies with high fixed costs will need to produce higher revenues every single time period to compensate for these costs. And this is a key idea. The more fixed costs my company has, the more I have to be concerned about generating enough revenue every month to cover those costs so that I make money. That is, I am profitable rather than losing money, making me unprofitable. Typically, high fixed cost businesses aim to drive volume growth over price growth, since an increase in volume doesn't proportionally increase costs. And so, the focus very often on high fixed cost companies with high fixed costs, is to increase revenues by increasing the number of units sold, even if I have to discount the price a little bit to make those to be able to sell more goods. Most high fixed cost businesses are willing to cut price to increase revenues. So if you're working with a company, understanding whether they operate in primarily a high fixed or a high variable cost business is important, since it results in different marketing decisions. Some examples of high fixed cost companies include things like semiconductor companies, airlines, automobile manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, but also things like golf courses. That is, any business where the company has to have a relatively high outlet of of um, of money to cover the costs associated with the business, regardless of how much volume the business has. There is no easy way to lower costs by simply producing fewer goods, because the high fixed costs are always there. A golf course is a really good example. So I own a golf course, and I buy a golf course, and I borrow a bunch of money, so I have this big mortgage payment every month. But there are also other things that have to happen at a golf course. So one of the things that I have to do at the golf course is I have to maintain it. And maintaining the golf course does not change hardly at all, depending on whether or not I have high volumes of play or low volume of play, because the golf course still has to be watered, the golf course still has to be fertilized, the golf course still has to be maintained, the grass cut, the greens cut, everything taken care of, regardless of how many rounds of golf are played on it. So this is an example, of course, of a business that has high fixed costs. So what happens at a golf course is that it is important that the golf course generate large amounts of revenue so that they can cover all of those fixed costs. Firms with high fixed costs tend to focus on volume strategies, and they're and as we said earlier, they are willing to cut price to increase volume, since the increase in volume does not result in large amounts of increased variable costs, because most of their costs are fixed costs. The key is productive use of the fixed cost, that is capacity management, and the idea that what I need to do is generate the most revenue I can from the capacity that I have generated by these fixed costs. An airline is very, very similar. I lease all these airlines. I have to lease the gates at the airports. I have to have a large number of staff at the airports, a large number of staff to fly the planes and service the planes. And so all those costs are fixed. And as a result, my focus needs to be on generating maximum revenue, given the fact that I am in a high fixed cost business. Of course, in the long run, no costs are fixed costs. So, what about high fixed cost companies? So, one of the strategies for high fixed cost companies over time is to try to lower fixed costs by streamlining the operations. I also might lower my fixed costs through outsourcing. That is, rather than having my own staff, I might outsource my staffing and then only use the staffing when I need it, moving my staffing from fixed to variable. I also might lower my fixed costs by investing in technology and automation in a way that reduces perhaps fixed labor costs. And also things like lowering fixed costs by increasing the efficiency and productivity of my capacity. That is, if so Southwest Airlines is a really good example of this. They run their airline as efficiently as they possibly can to take most advantage of their high fixed costs associated with leasing planes, having to fly them with the fuel for every flight, regardless of how many people are on it, uh, the ground employees that they have, the air travel employees that they have, and then of course the maintenance expenses that they have. High variable cost companies are sort of just the opposite. A company with high variable costs and low fixed costs will need to produce higher prices and margins to create a profit. That is, if I have a high variable cost, I have to have a high price to cover those variable costs. There are lots of businesses that are high variable cost businesses, and of course, for them, it's price margins that is the most important and not volume. Their typical high variable cost businesses aim to drive price maintenance, that is, maintaining their prices so that they maintain their margins. They're more interested in that than they are in volume growth. So they're not they're so high variable cost businesses uh, prefer to increase um, the prices and keep the margins the same, and they do not like to generate more revenue by lowering prices, because when they have to produce more goods, their variable cost numbers obviously then go up. So high variable cost businesses primarily focus on increasing their pricing power. So think about someone like Coach. They incur a substantial variable cost for every unit of good that they produce, and so their focus then is on higher prices versus higher volume at a lower price. And so Coach maximizes their profitability by maintaining their prices, and if they have to, selling fewer goods but at a lower price. High variable cost businesses often cannot increase volume by cutting prices, because it simply reduces the margin and the firm ends up in the same or even worse place in terms of profit. Because every time you cut price with high variable costs, it really has a negative impact on profits. Often, businesses with high turnover of physical products are associated with high variable cost organizations. These are things like retailers often. Okay. These might include things like grocery stores, department stores, and some clothing retailers. But it also includes things like fast food organizations, and restaurants and delivery services, and even many services like auto repair have high variable costs because they have to pay for the mechanics that they employ, which is their main cost driver. Okay. Also, other firms with customization and industries with large human elements per delivered product, that is, a lot of labor per individually delivered products, tend to be high variable cost organizations. Companies with high proportion of variable costs relative to fixed costs are considered to be more likely to stay in business because they can always lower their expenses by simply lowering their volume of output, which makes them capable of being able to weather the storm associated with a recession or depression. Variable costs are costs incurred to create or deliver um, each unit of output. So, by definition, they change with the number of units produced. For example, Uber pays a driver for every ride they complete. Of course, this is a variable cost then. More rides that they produce, the more rides they have to pay for. And this is Uber's primary expense. So Uber is a high variable cost business with very low fixed costs. And as a result, it impacts their strategy. It is important that you understand how the costs impact the business and how variable cost based businesses are different from high fixed cost businesses. So, in terms of managing variable costs, cutting variable costs by doing things like outsourcing, replacing parts, optimization processes is much easier than obviously than cutting fixed costs. You'll be dealing with a lot of costs throughout your time as a consultant. Some of the things that you need to do when you're trying to manage variable costs: scrutinize your product and services for cost savings opportunities. We tend to call these CIPs, cost improvement programs. Negotiating better terms with suppliers. That is, if I'm a retailer, one of the ways I can lower my variable costs is by getting the products that I'm going to be reselling at a lower price. That's why it is so important for someone like Walmart to and other discount retailers to negotiate the best possible terms with their suppliers. Another way to that variable cost companies can manage their variable costs is by managing their labor expenses. Sometimes this is done through automation. Sometimes this is done through simply streamlining the processes so that my labor per good sold is reduced. And of course, maybe investing in advanced business technology that allows us to become more effective and more efficient. And then, of course, we have something called avoidable and unavoidable costs. Unavoidable costs are generally more fixed in nature and cannot be eliminated, even if the company takes certain actions like discontinuing a product line um, um, and things like that. Any cost that can be eliminated is referred to as potentially an avoidable cost. For example, if a company has a product line that is underperforming or outdated, it may choose to stop the production on that line. The costs associated with that product line then are considered to be avoidable costs because I do not have to incur those costs. I simply don't produce that product anymore. This is what you see car manufacturers doing. Here's a good example might be something like a happy hour. Generally speaking, a bartender would be considered to be a fixed cost. That is, if I own a bar and I have to have one or two bartenders there at all points in time, regardless of how much volume I produce. But if I have a happy hour and for my happy hour business increases, and to take care of that business, I have to hire an extra bartender. That extra bartender is considered to be an avoidable expense because if I didn't have the happy hour, I wouldn't have to bring in the extra bartender. So the regular bartenders are unavoidable costs, but the extra bartender for the happy hour turns out to be an avoidable cost. It's important for businesses to identify avoidable and unavoidable costs. And then there's this concept of sunk versus relevant costs. You often hear people talk about, well, that's a sunk cost. You can't worry about that cost. Well, sunk costs are independent of any event and should not be considered when making investment or product decisions. Only relevant costs, that is, costs related to a specific decision and will change depending on that decision, should be considered when making such decisions. The sunk cost fallacy, then, is a psychological barrier that ties people to an unsuccessful endeavors simply because they're committed to um, they've committed resources to it. That is sort of the idea of pouring good money after bad. Even though I may have spent a bunch of money on something already, if it turns out that it's not successful, I can't I shouldn't consider those monies that I've already spent when I make future marketing decisions in that area, because those costs have already incurred. They're gone. I can never get them back. So if I have costs that I can never get back, those are in fact sunk costs. The costs that I'm interested in when I make a marketing decisions are those costs that are related to this specific decision. Okay, so let's then talk about profits. We've talked about revenue, we talked about costs. Let's talk about profits. Profit is the money you have left after paying all of your expenses. There are three main types of profit: gross profit, operating profits, and net profits. Let's talk about each one. Gross profits is the biggest profit. It is the amount of money that was left over after paying for the goods and services sold. That is the cost of goods sold. So if I'm in the a clothing store business, the amount of money I have paid for the clothing is a the amount of money I pay for the clothing is the cost of goods sold, and then the revenues minus the amount I paid for those is the gross profit. So the gross profit in any business is the amount of revenue that I accumulated minus the costs associated with acquiring or producing or accumulating the goods that I ended up and services that I ended up selling. So the gross profit margin and unit gross profit margin are important metrics for many organizations, and marketers need to be aware of that. Gross profit margin is the profit after subtracting the cost of goods sold. Um, it is typically calculated as a percentage. The ratio indicates the percentage of each dollar of revenue that the company retains as gross profit. So gross profit is the revenue minus the cost of goods sold. And then if I divide that by the original total revenue, that gives me the gross profit margin. So you buy t-shirts for $6 and sell them for $10. The gross profit margin is $4 or 40%. The next type of profit that we like to talk about is operating profit. So the operating profit is the money left after paying all the business costs, but before paying any taxes. So the operating profit is the revenue minus the cost of goods sold plus any other expenses that are incurred in the business. So this includes things like salaries and rent and licenses and insurances and accountants, and all the other things that cost money to run a business. Um, Typically, when we have a restaurant business, we like to argue that for a restaurant business that uh, that for every dollar of revenue, one 33 cents of those dollars are typically tied to cost of goods sold, and another 33 cents of every dollar is tied into um, other expenses, operating expenses, so that my operating profit then is still 1/3 of that $1. So the operating profit shows that your business can generate more money than it spends. However, you still have to pay taxes before you get to the net profit, which of course is the money that you get to keep. So operating profit margin before taxes um, is is simply the sales minus the cost of goods sold minus the selling expenses and business expenses and the fixed costs. That's how you get to the operating profit. And then there, of course, is net profit. The net profit is the money you have left over after all expenses and taxes are paid. And of course, companies always like to be what's called in the black, that is, have a positive net profit rather than a net loss. Okay, net profit is often called the bottom line because it appears as the last line in the income statement after all expenses have been taken out. The way to get to net profit margins after taxes is sales minus the cost of goods sold, minus the selling expenses, minus the fixed operating expenses, and minus the taxes. So here we have a typical look at how net profit margins might look. Maybe my gross profit is 55%, my operating profit is 15%, but then my net profit might be only 11%. And that's how we get to what we say is this company has a net profit percentage of 11%. There are other terms that are important in marketing, and some of those terms include things like the contribution analysis, that is, the break even numbers. So contribution analysis, one of the interesting aspects of this is how many units do I have to sell to break even? That is, cover my fixed and variable costs so that I don't lose money. So if I have $40,000 in fixed costs, $20 in gross profit margin, I need 2,000 units to cover those fixed costs. If we lower the price by $5 to increase sales, but the problem is that when I do that, it lowers my gross profit margin, and I have to sell more units. That is 667 more units just to break even. So we need to talk about break even analysis and the concept of what do I have to do in my business to break even. The problem, of course, is that with high fixed cost businesses, the break even number is typically higher, and as a result, I need to be able to sell more goods. On the other hand, for a high variable cost company, my break even point tends to be lower as long as I can maintain my profit margin. A couple of other marketing terms that we might want to consider. One is the concept of a contribution analysis, sensitivity analysis. A sensitivity analysis is a what if calculation where I ask, what if I did things like change the price? Then what happens to my profits? So here's an example. At a price of $4, my net profits are $10,000. I sell 25,000 units. My sales are $100,000. My cost of goods sold is 50% of that. My gross profits are 50,000 are 50,000 dollars and 50%. My selling expenses, my fixed costs come into play here. Then I have my operating profit of $10,000. Well, what happens if I can increase the price by $1 to $5 and I sell the same number of units? Well, then my profits go up by 25%, all the way up to $35,000. An amazing increase with only what? A $1 increase in price. So if I increase my price to $5 though, how many units do I have to sell to get back at least to those $10,000 of net profit? And the answer is 16,667 units. That is, I could sell a third less units and I would still be able to break even in terms of having the same net profit as I had at $4. There's also the notion of return on investment. We always hear the story, ROI, ROI, what's my return on investment? Well, return on investment is really return on cost, and it's the ratio between net income and the amount of money I spend to get that income. A high ROI means that the amount of money I spent returns a larger amount of revenue. So as a performance measure, ROI is used to evaluate the efficiency or the value of the investment over time. So the ROI is net return over the cost of that investment. So I invest in uh, a new margarita machine at my bar. Well, at the end of the day, I need to figure out how much does that impact my overall revenues versus how much did it cost me to buy that margarita machine in the first place. That is an analysis that is referred to as return on investment. The final concept here is discounted cash flow. And what this has to do with is how much is a dollar today worth in the future. So here we have a little example. That is, I have bought something for my business. I've made an investment that will return $120,000 a year for 6 years. So my total return is $720. But that's $720,000. But that $720,000 I get over 6 years. If I believe that I could have just put that money in the bank and gotten 4% on it, which of course is very easy to do today. You would then make the argument that that $720 is really only worth $654,000 because I need to discount the value of that money over time. This has to do with that financial problems that you used to have in your marketing 30 or your finance 301 class that dealt with the time value of money and the discount rate. The higher the discount rate, the less value money is over time. And you can see that distinction here. With no discount rate, 6 years, $720,000. If I discount it by 4%, then it's worth $654,000 today. And if I discount it by 8%, it's only worth $479,125 today. So we need to understand the time value of money and what discount rates does to the value of our cash flows over time. In summary, you need to understand the basics of finance if you're going to be any good at making marketing decisions. So, This is the opportunity to take all those things that you learned in your basic finance class and apply them to marketing strategies.